The 2024 U.S. presidential election is here, and Muslim Network TV is bringing you the coverage that matters. On November 5th and 6th, join us live at 8 p.m. Eastern as we dive into the election night action, bringing you real-time results and in-depth conversations on what this election means for Muslim Americans and beyond. Our panel of experts, community voices, and political analysts will break down the night's key moments, from the policies shaping America to the voices shaping our future. Stay with us as we track the vote count, analyze the big wins and losses, and discuss the issues that matter most to you. Whether it's your first time voting or your 10th, this election is crucial, and we're here to keep you informed every step of the way. Join us for live election coverage you can trust, November 5th and 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern on Muslim Network TV. Election 2024. Your voice, your future. Tune in live on Muslim Network TV.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening, and welcome to Muslim Network TV's special election coverage. I'm Hannah Zubairi. Tonight, we're diving into what yesterday's election results mean for our country and what they mean for our communities. This election hit differently, didn't it? For Palestinians, for Muslims, for African Americans, for other marginalized groups. It's not just about who won. It's about our safety, our rights, and our future. So let me ask, are we angrier today than we were through the entire last year? Should we be? Did the Muslim community show that they have a red line that cannot be crossed? And if so, where do we go from here? Let's talk about the Muslim vote in this election. The Gaza genocide may not have been a driving factor for most voters, but was it critical in states like Michigan? Did Muslim majority areas that traditionally vote blue flip to red in response to Gaza, ultimately giving Trump a victory in the state? When the margins are tight, do we realize just how much our votes count? And if someone from the Democratic establishment tries to tell us that we were too small to matter, do the Michigan results suggest otherwise? Tonight, we have guests who aren't afraid to ask the tough questions and offer unfiltered insights. We're here to understand what this election means for U.S. policies, discuss strategies for resistance, and explore what it takes to build real political power. So let's get started. We're joined by Professor Scott Gack of Trinity College, and we'll be joined by Sabrina Salvati, who is the host and creator of Sabi Sab's podcast and the co-host of Revolutionary Blackout Network. So Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me today, Hannah.
To start, let's look at what a Trump presidency means for this country. We've been through 4 years of his policies before. So, Professor, as an author, historian, and associate professor of American Studies and History, let me ask you, what should we expect this time round? Are we facing more of the same policies, or are we looking at even more of a hardline approach?
I mean, that's the question that obviously everybody right now is grappling with, and it is obviously still in the wake of yesterday. It seems particularly bleak, but right now we're looking at a Senate that can empower the incoming president in ways that he wasn't previously, and we also have an agenda that is much starker and even much more militant in many different ways toward many different populations. Uh, and I think it's going to take us all a while to figure out where, and you already raised this question of resistance, right? But where will be the most important and valuable and efficient ways to resist? Because right now it feels maybe perhaps a little overwhelming, because there's uncertainty. Because if you remember from last go around with the Trump presidency as well, there are lots of things that are said. What things are going to be acted on and what things aren't going to be acted on are always seemingly up for grab. And one week to another, the most important issue can change on a dime. And so right now, though, it seems that, the idea that the instant he assumes office, that this notion of mass deportations seem to be very important to him and his constituency. And so I think that would be a spot right there to start to think about what that might look like and how one starts. I mean, I'm thinking back already, right, to the idea of sanctuary cities that came up during the last Trump presidency, and I'm in Connecticut, and I'm already seeing local officials starting to refresh that language again. And so, that seems like a place to start.
Yes, sanctuary cities was definitely something that was here in Maryland. We saw that play out as well. Now, do you think he's going to bring in the military? Are we going to be seeing much more of a graphic like show? Because that's something that he's a showman. So that also comes with that territory. What I've been reading about that.
The answer, unfortunately, is yes. I mean, I do. I do think that part of the show, right, the authority that he wishes to wield on this topic, seems to be, it's a bad place to take cues from, social media. But if you look through some of the social media scrolls of Trump supporters right now, there's these depictions of planes removing people, kind of military planes, tanks rolling down streets. I pray that that's not right, that's not how this plays out. But the 1798 Alien Act that he's been talking about does give some good latitude to the president to operate against populations that are considered foreign or immigrant. In 1798, it was French immigrants that it was used against, and it certainly seems legally possible.
Now, do you think, as we're looking at this, what can the Biden administration still has November and December? What can the Biden administration do to perhaps put some safeguards around? I mean, they betted on a few things, they lost. Can we still have any hopes from them?
That's an excellent question. I'm looking to see how that plays out, because I don't know. My answer to you is that I don't know, because most of the executive actions that President Biden could take in certain situations can also be very quickly rolled back by the next president, right? Those things aren't set in stone, if you would, right? If you were talking about congressional action, which isn't going to happen, right? But if congressional action has a little more staying power in this kind of time frame. But yeah, no, I don't think there's that much that can be done.
Sabrina, thank you for joining us. Sabrina, with your work on the Revolutionary Blackout Network, and as someone deeply connected to grassroots movement, I want to ask, what's the feeling in the Black community today after these election results? There's a lot to unpack here, and I know perspectives within the community are varied, but what do you make of Black voters who cast their ballots for Trump around this time? And what is the general feeling, what you've been hearing?
Well, I think it's good to differentiate between black people that voted and black people that did not vote, and I think that most black voters are not happy with Donald Trump winning this presidential election, but most black people that did not vote couldn't care either way. And I think it's important for people to understand that the majority of Black Americans in this country do not vote because they don't believe that the political system is going to improve their community, which is understandable because we have not seen improvements, regardless if it's a Republican or a Democrat candidate. But all the signs were there. And this is something that I've covered heavily under the Biden-Harris administration. There has been frustration. I heard you talk about the sanctuary cities. There has been frustration from Black Americans in those sanctuary cities about the migrant crisis that's been happening under the Biden-Harris administration. And they've been very vocal about feeling neglected by governors, by mayors. The governors and mayors have spoken out that they have not received the help and assistance from the Biden administration, and they have reached out to Biden multiple times asking for help. That's Chicago, that's New York City. Eric Adams was very vocal about Biden not trying to help him with this situation in New York. And that also includes my state here of Massachusetts, where Governor Healy and Mayor Michelle Wu of Boston have also reached out to the Biden administration with no help with the situation. So the Black community, there is a bit of a divide from those of us that do live in states that have sanctuary cities and those that do not. But there has been a realignment here, particularly with this presidential election. What we are seeing with the numbers is that Donald Trump was able to double his support in a state like Wisconsin with Black voters. We're seeing that Donald Trump increased his support from Black American men in this presidential campaign. We are seeing that Donald Trump has increased the Latino vote ahead of Kamala Harris in this particular campaign. So there is something about Donald Trump's campaign, and I think it's the economic message, and I think it's also the message on immigration that has more groups that were typically vote Democrat going towards Donald Trump this time around than before. The fact that Donald Trump won the popular vote and not just the Electoral College also speaks volumes. He was able to get gains in blue states like New York and California and New Jersey that he couldn't before. So this is a strong message that has been sent to the Biden-Harris administration because he won that popular vote. It would have been different, I think, if he did not win the popular vote and he won the Electoral College. But the fact that he won both and the Republicans they retook the Senate, it's a strong message. And I think a lot of it has to do with some of the failures of the Biden-Harris campaign, which I've spoken about for quite some time.
So I also wanted to, because when I'm reading, you're scrolling through social media, and especially in anti-racism work, you see a lot of anger and a lot of also miscommunication and between who's going to get oppressed more, and sometimes that's what it feels like, and there are divisions even within minority communities. So do you think we are ready for this in marginalized communities? I wanted to ask if, what are some strategies for resilience to deal with some of these challenges that are going to be coming up for us? So I'd like to ask you about some resilience strategies, and how can communities set ourselves up using perhaps mutual aid networks or other community defense systems?
I think it's important, number one, that you know your neighbors, and some people do not. This is how I'm able to organize here in Massachusetts. Organizing is going to be key within your community. And I think that needs to be the first step. So number one, you need to know your neighbors so that you can organize effectively. I do know that some people are worried. They are scared. They're wondering, what if I'm going to get deported? I don't know if I 100% believe that there's going to be this military presence of deportations that Donald Trump is talking about. I'm not 100% sure if I believe that. I also know there were a lot of people that were deported under Obama and and Joe Biden. This isn't discussed as much, but they also deported a lot of people as well. But you have to organize within your community. You have to know who your community is, and you have to know who you can trust within that community, so that if that time comes where you do feel like you are going to get some type of threat thrown your way, it is important that you are very, very well familiar with your community and that you have a trust that is built there. Mutual aid is another one. This is something that I do here in the Boston area, where we do help families that are in need. So mutual aid networks, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's shelter, some people just may need help with other things, such as a babysitting, something that they may not be able to pay for at that point in time. But it has to start with you knowing who your neighbors are. And this is where I strongly encourage people not to spend as much time on social media and to spend more of their time trying to meet and collaborate with people in person.
Beautiful, beautiful thought. What are your thoughts on Harris's concession speech?
Oh boy. I think that Kamala Harris, I think the concession speech should have happened last night. I did not think it was proper to exit the way that she did last night. People didn't even know that she was gone. That the crowd that was there at Howard University, she didn't say goodbye. She just left. And that's not the way this works. Typically, it is the first candidate that will issue a response is the candidate that has lost. So for her to leave and not tell people that she left, it was just kind of weird to me. And I do realize there were several videos where we showed last night, we were live streaming, where the crowd at Howard University just didn't know where she went. And they were like, why did she leave? What is going on here? And the campaign manager had to speak to let them know that she's gone. So I don't think that was the proper way to handle it. But that I will also say, I have a lot of criticism of this administration in particular with the way that they chose to handle Gaza, Lebanon, the West Bank. I have a lot of criticism about the genocide in Gaza with this administration and them not wanting to hold themselves accountable and to fix that issue with Israel, to withhold weapons from Israel. So my feelings toward this administration is very strong. So people have to understand that. But the speech that she gave, while I feel like it was, a typical mild-mannered political concession speech, at the end of the day, I think the Democratic Party needs to take a hard look at themselves and ask, what do they want to become? Because it is really interesting to me, a number of people that were willing to vote for Donald Trump because they believe that he will stop the war in the Middle East, that he will stop the genocide in Gaza. Donald Trump going to Dearborn, Michigan and speaking to Muslim voters there. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris never stepped foot in Dearborn, Michigan. It's an absolute disaster. And I truly believe that if Kamala Harris would have agreed to an arms embargo, if she would have agreed to a permanent ceasefire, Kamala Harris probably could have won last night. At least she probably could have won Michigan. And I've spoken to a number of members of the Muslim community that said this is a red line for them. This is why some of them chose to support someone like Jill Stein, or some of them chose to support Donald Trump. And I think this message that needs to be sent out is that the Democratic Party needs to understand that moving to the right is not a winning strategy. Adding a Liz Cheney to your campaign is not a winning strategy. And they have to understand that they need to listen to their base. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that Kamala Harris's campaign made is that they didn't listen to their base. They decided that it was more important to try to, get along with Republicans like Liz Cheney and these non-Trump voters. And in the end, I think that backfired.
Professor Scott, I wanted to ask you about, as you're listening to this, and I know it's very new for a lot of us, but many of people in your position, you're looking at either scenarios, a Harris win or a Trump win. So in your opinion, what changes should we expect in the coming months? What does the future of the Supreme Court look like? And are we looking at further shifts that could have long-term impacts on the judiciary, Many people are worried about civil rights and the environmental protections that have been in place. So if you could steer the conversation that way.
Well, I think that's one of the successes. I use that term very, very, very loosely, right? One of the things that the last Trump administration was able to do successfully, maybe that's the best way to put it, is to reshape a good deal of the federal judiciary with quite conservative judges, not only on the High Court, which has received, of course, the most attention, but throughout the federal court system, and we have every reason to expect that they will continue that push and will be able to do so quite handily with the new Senate. So. So that's and we also have two Supreme Court justices who are getting older. It may be Clarence Thomas. It may be time, or maybe thinking about given that Trump will be in office for the next 4 years. So while there won't be a shift, I don't think a shift in the Supreme Court, I think even if there is some switching of actual members, I would suspect that it will remain kind of the same split that we have today. So yeah, that's something that's important. It's something that unfortunately it's been challenging for the Biden administration to get people judges approved, though they've worked very hard to do so. And I think that will leave a lasting legacy. We're talking decades-long legacies in this respect, and that's there's not much that people can do at this point in that particular aspect, and it's real. It's very hard. It's very hard to think of ways again to work around that. Obviously, court reform was bandied about a little bit in the last 4 years of creating a Supreme Court that is a little less politicized, and that has maybe some term limits, and that would provide for each president to nominate a certain number of judges at any given point as people would rotate off, but that's not coming to any fruition at this point in time.
So were there any other races that either one of you would really paying attention to, local races, state elections, Congress, and any surprises?
There was one here in Connecticut that Jahana Hayes, who was up against George Logan for the House, and Connecticut has actually remained pretty radical, and Hayes was able to retain, thankfully able to retain her seat. It was, I feel like in some ways that we're in a different, almost like in a different world within the boundaries of this state than most of the rest of the experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there was a candidate that was running in Nebraska named Dan Osborne. He was running as an independent. And at one point that race was very close. So I thought he had a chance to win. And what was interesting about him is that he said that he didn't want to choose either party to caucus with if he were to win. So he said he wouldn't choose the Republicans or the Democrat. He wanted to be independent from both of them. So I was kind of looking forward to someone trying to break that lane a little bit, but unfortunately he didn't win.
Mm. And that is one lesson perhaps that a lot of marginalized communities could be looking at. A lot of times we look at the top of the ticket, and smaller local elections are not paid as much attention to sometimes. I know that's something absolutely in the American Muslim community where we'll see a lot of activity during presidential elections, but during the midterm elections or primaries, that activity just isn't there. So what are some maybe perhaps some strategies for marginalized communities as we look at local elections and others, as we, I know it's like the day after. I'm still like I'm not in shock. I was kind of expecting this. I did not think America was ready for a person of color, a woman who's a person of color to be president. And so I was kind of expecting this Trump presidency, but just thinking ahead to what marginalized communities could be working on as to gear up for 2026.
I think it's really important that people don't look over the local actions that you can get involved in. Oftentimes, we are all paying attention to the presidential election because that receives the most press. But there's also positions such as school board, city council, of course, mayor, that I encourage people to run for. The city council, although it may seem like a smaller role, it is very important because the city council controls the budget. So that's an important position that you can have. To get involved in grassroots organization, I also think and encourage people to do that as well. There's a number of them in your area. If you just Google whatever topic that you are interested in, I can pretty much guarantee you there's going to be grassroots organization that's there and that's available. And also at the same time, I do encourage people that live in ballot initiative states to please pay attention to those local ballot measures that are on the ballot. There were a number of measures that passed this year that I thought were very important, such as increasing the tipped wage, unionization for rideshare drivers. These are very important, and I feel like a lot of times they're overlooked because there is so much focus on the presidential race. And at the same time, I encourage people who do also live in a ballot initiative state, right now is the time to start planning to run ballot measures for, I think, 2026.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to echo Sabrina's mention of the boards of education. I'm an educator, so I can't help this, right? Board of Education. I actually expect, right? This is going to be. It's been a battleground in the last few years, depending on what state you're in, but pretty much in almost every state, there's been a lot of battle over what is taught and what isn't taught in our schools. And I can't stress enough, how important being on the Board of Education and advocating for the kinds of material that you want to see. It's so crucial, and it's going to get that much more important if Trump is sincere in his push to eliminate the Department of Education. It will become only that much more important.
That is absolutely correct. And this is something that even as we're looking at voter guides that come out many times from the perspective of marginalized communities, those voter guides sometimes do not. For example, on my ballot, there were 4 judges. And unless you go up and look at the backgrounds of each one of those judges, what do they stand for, it's very hard to and most of us are making very uninformed decisions when we're circling, marking it yes or no. So that is also something that and it's very, very hard to ask oppressed communities to do that work because they're so, like, some of us are still struggling to put groceries on the table, right? Like food on the table. And then you're asking those same communities to also look at those judges to make sure that, oh, these aren't judges that are going to put our boys behind bars. So who do you think should be doing that work?
I think it starts with education. This is another community activity that I can encourage people to do as well, is to educate people within your community about who the judges are. What do these ballot questions actually mean? Sometimes they're worded in such a way that can be confusing to people, and sometimes that's intentional. There were a number of states, for example, that had ranked choice voting on the ballot this election cycle. But I think it's going to take some of that community education and just teaching people how civics works. I think that this is very important so that people know who's in charge of what. What does your city council do? Do you know who your city councilors are? Who are the judges in your area? Do you know who they are? Do you know their record? And I think a lot of people don't, because to your point, a lot of times we don't have time to pay attention to all of those things because we are busy working and we also have families. So I think that's a big part of it. And for people like me, it's a little bit different because this is what I do, because I have the podcast. So that is something I always try to keep in mind, is that we do have to start with political education.
Very, very true. Well, we're going to take a short break, so please stay with us.
The 2024 U.S. presidential election is here, and Muslim Network TV is bringing you the coverage that matters, bringing you real-time results and in-depth conversations on what this election means for Muslim Americans and beyond. Our panel of experts, community voices, and political analysts will break down the night's key moments. This election is crucial, and we're here to keep you informed. November 5th and 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern on Muslim Network TV.
Welcome back. So we're going to move on to our next section, and we have, for our next segment, we're talking about the implications for Gaza and the Middle East. Trump's approach to the region, particularly regarding Israel and Palestine, has been anything but subtle. With him back in office, what does this mean for those facing oppression and genocide? We have with us Dr. Rania Masri, a Palestinian scholar who has been organizing for Palestinian liberation for decades, and Katie Halper, an American podcaster, political commentator. Thank you both for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you
Thanks for having us.
Dr. Masri, welcome back to the US. You've been in Lebanon and teaching there for many years. Today, how are you doing?
Well, I am very proud of the Arab American community in the United States. I am very proud that we did not succumb to the threats and the accusations and the attempted briberies that were thrown at us from the Democratic Party and from the others. I am very proud of every individual in this country that chose not to vote for Kamala Harris. I think what was most important has happened, which is that we show the Democratic Party that we do not forgive genocide and we do not condone genocide and we do not recognize the threat that there is something worse than genocide that could come. Therefore, we need to accept the genocide because there could be something worse. It is a sad day on another hand because the third-party voters did not come to fruition. Instead, we saw when we look at the numbers that we have approximately 14 million people who chose not to vote for the Democratic Party and who chose not to vote at all. So instead of having people step away from the Democrats and step into building an alternative, instead we had people that simply stepped away. And the numbers that I'm saying are based on the comparison between the number of votes that Biden got in 2020 and the number of votes that Kamala Harris got. She got almost 14 million less votes than Joseph Biden at a time when it's not as if those votes did not go to Donald Trump. Donald Trump also got 2 million less votes than he did in 2020. So what we see is when we look at simply the numbers, we see that a significant percentage of American voters have felt disenfranchised by both parties, but mostly the Democrats lost their base. And what saddens me is rather than stepping away from the Democrats and into an alternative, be it even the Libertarian, the Green Party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, any third party, instead 14 million Americans simply stepped out of the election.
And this is despite democracy being, I believe that was the number one concern of those who did vote. So that was very surprising. So now we know that Trump's policies in the Middle East were relentless in their support for Israel. What's the immediate fallout in Gaza likely to look like? And let me ask you this, is there any real chance for international pressure to hold Israel accountable? Or is this administration a free pass for, God forbid, more escalation?
The free pass, I actually think, was Biden-Harris. With the Trump administration, we have a question mark. To be fair, we just have a question mark. With the Biden-Harris administration, when we compare that administration to all administration that came previous to them, every single one, we know for a fact, based on the metrics, that the Biden-Harris administration has been the most pro-Israeli administration in terms of the number of military aid, in terms of the financial support, in terms of the blank checks, in terms of the flat out lies, and on and on and on. So in comparison to that, if we look at the 4 years that Trump served before Biden, it is very unlikely that he will continue the carte blanche, like we say, the we sign on a blank piece of paper to Netanyahu that Joseph Biden did. But there's no guarantee. So it's a question mark with Donald Trump versus with Biden-Harris, it was a guarantee.
SubhanAllah. Katie, you're no stranger to the media narrative, the media dynamics surrounding Gaza. We've been following how the media has been complicit in this genocide. As you look at the election results and how it's being covered, what are you seeing that you can point out to us and comment on?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, and apologies in advance. I'm sick. It's I'm sick of the elections and of politics and politicians, so I'm physically that way as well. But yeah, I think that we are seeing as expected, because as you just mentioned, the media has been so complicit in the genocide. And not surprisingly, it's being complicit in the Democrats' attempt to totally deflect any criticism. And what we're seeing, not surprisingly, is that the Democrats are blaming the usual suspects and taking all of the wrong takeaways from this election, and the media is helping them do that. So you had Joe Scarborough talking about trans people being at fault, talking about how it's racist Latinos and misogynist Black men. You had Al Sharpton making that point. Also, you have people saying that the takeaway from this is that progressive politics are dead. You even had an investment banker on CNBC say that progressive politics were dead and blaming progressive politics for Trump's win, even though, as he himself acknowledged, he didn't run on progressive issues, but he said there was a progressive aura. I have no idea what that means. But, I think what we're seeing is people who claim to see Trump as a fascist, instead of demanding and calling on Kamala to run as a candidate who she was never going to call it genocide, obviously, but she could have said that she was going to impose an arms embargo. I mean, it is, to be clear, it is genocide, and you can just ask the experts in this. But it's interesting that all the people who were crapping on third-party voters, Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, who said that they weren't going to vote for Kamala Harris, it's interesting they spent so much time demonizing these people as opposed to pushing the Democrat to actually do not just the moral thing. I mean, I think we would all agree that's the moral thing, but it was actually the politically strategic thing to do. And I think we're seeing people blame marginalized people, and it's not surprising. It is disturbing. And there are lots of people, if you want to blame for this, and it's not Palestinian voters, Palestinian American voters, or people who support Palestinians. If you want to blame people, you can blame Joe Biden. You can blame him for not dropping out, for Democrats for covering up his cognitive decline. You can blame Kamala Harris for not pointing out how she would be a departure from Joe Biden. You can blame Kamala Harris for courting Liz Cheney. You can blame Liz Cheney for having all that blood on her hands and her father's blood on her hands. You can blame Bill Clinton for what he said in Michigan. You can blame Richie Torres for what he said in Michigan. You can blame the campaign for sending Richie Torres to Michigan. I mean, you really can. There are lots of options. And so I really urge people to not blame third-party voters, to not blame Jill Stein, to not blame people who couldn't bring themselves to vote for Harris. And also, the data just doesn't bear out the claim that it was the third party's fault. People assume, because they project their own politics onto others, they assume that, but for Jill Stein, people would have voted for Kamala Harris. That's just not true for the most part. That's not how people who support third parties vote.
If I could add to that a few things,
Sure, go ahead.
I would have no problem taking the credit for the loss
Right.
of Kamala Harris.
Mhm.
I was part of the Abandon Biden campaign, part of the Abandon Harris campaign. I would be proud to carry that, and I would consider it an honor. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we were able to do that, but I cannot do that.
Right.
Because the ones that take the credit for the loss of Kamala Harris are the whole Democratic establishment dating back to when Bill Clinton was president. They have excelled in transforming the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. Excelled from Bill Clinton onwards. And then they wonder why they lost the Democratic base. When on economic policies, they are endorsed by Wall Street. When Kamala Harris even removed the condemnation of torture and the death penalty from the Democratic platform for the first time ever. When on oil drillings, and I say this as an environmental justice activist, when on oil drillings, Kamala Harris was proud that under Joe Biden, she had historic oil drillings. And even when we compare Donald Trump's record to Barack Obama and to Joe Biden, we see that under Donald Trump, oil drillings went down in the United States. They were higher under Barack Obama and much higher under Joe Biden. So from an environmental perspective, they don't carry that. They're actually to the right of the Republicans. When it comes to immigration, now people are so worried about immigration. Donald Trump carries a big talk, but it is the Democrats that carry the really horrific policies. Barack Obama was the deportation president. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris actually were worse on immigration than Donald Trump even wanted to be. So when we look at all of these, and then when we look at Kamala Harris was gleeful, bless you, she was gleeful that she was endorsed by more than 200 Republicans. How could you be gleeful to get the endorsement of the opposition party? And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris kept saying for the past 4 years how much they welcome the Republicans and how much they want to have Republicans in the cabinet, and on and on and on. So basically for the US voter, those who are watching this, put Gaza aside, put foreign policy aside. Foreign policy is not the reason why people vote in the United States.
4%.
As much as we want to say it, it's not the reason. We put that aside and we see for the Democratic voter who's looking at this and who has the courage to actually look at policy and not at rhetoric, which I would argue are a very small number, but nevertheless, for that Democratic voter, they would say, well, this is not my party. And for the Republicans who they are pandering to, why go with a Republican light when you can go with the true Republican and vote Republican? So this is the scary part. But yet, when we look at the Democratic Party, we see that they will never learn the lesson. So this becomes the responsibility of every US citizen who really is progressive or who really claims to be so-called liberal to step away from the Democratic Party. Let it die, let it crumble, let it wither, let it burn, and let us build a new one.
Scott, Professor Scott, I wanted to ask you what the youth vote was something that a lot of people perhaps were hoping, counting on, Gen Z vote, but we didn't see that play out. What effect do you think this is going to have on what should we expect on American campuses in the next coming year?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. I can tell you a little bit from talking with people who are on campuses today that there were a good number of reports of a lot of young men who were very enthusiastic over the result from last night, and this speaks to a broader issue that has been kind of bubbling up for at least a decade now of young men in particular feeling not connected to a variety of political measures that have been going on, and the Trump campaign's outreach to them at least made them enthusiastic, even if they didn't vote. Is I think one of the best ways to put it. There's a way in which in U.S. history there has always, that when there have been kind of major policies directed at a particular group, that the group that is left out of that policy eventually, right, they come in with a grievance. And right now, young men, and here I'm thinking about, and I'm not a critic of, please don't put me there, but I'm thinking about Title IX in particular, which has done wonderful and great and important things in many different ways for women and obviously also for women's athletics. but many young, right, without anything targeting young men over time, there's a feeling that they have been left behind, and in some ways, in terms of test scores and in terms of economic output, men have actually been left behind, and it's time for a way to uplift everyone instead of just in terms of gender policy. I do think we need to find ways to start to talk about that, because men have felt alienated often by the constant talk, and I'm guilty of the constant talk in my work on violence of toxic masculinity, and not offering people alternatives, right? Like real good alternatives from an earlier age, not when they're already in college, but talking about it earlier. And so, what's the lasting impact? I don't think that the Trump administration is offering an alternative to these men, by the way. I don't see that. I see them offering a place to air grievance, which is different, significantly different. So, I mean, I hope that is something kind of maybe hopefully starting on local levels, and again, going back to my earlier comment from before about schools and serving on boards of education, right, of trying to find ways to work these policies on a local level, because right now I can hear all the frustration from all of us, right? Like on a national political level, I don't think there's possibility, or there's not much possibility, and so that's it's at least for me, it's a time to think and participate locally, and to try to forge the change that I want to see in our communities, and then hopefully we can, I don't know that the Democratic Party is going to die anytime soon. Everybody was writing off the Republican Party that it was going to die, and then suddenly the Democratic Party is trying to take that big swath of moderate Republicans under its umbrella, which incidentally that was Kamala Harris's signature move when she was
I'm
running.
going to say something about local. You brought up school board elections, but let's talk about that. Anybody, I can see this in our local area, in Virginia, in many states here on the East Coast, where people who have publicly been have been for Palestinian freedom and have stood up for the Palestinian rights are now being tarred and feathered, and for them to run for office, even for local offices, has become such a challenge. Even to sit on commissions, people have been kicked off of commissions because they've tweeted support for to end the genocide. So this is something we do have Professor Amina Al-Din with us. Thank you, Dr. Amina, for joining us. How are you doing? Did you ever think that you would be seeing a second term for this, as you often call him, the convicted felon, as our president? I'm not able to hear you, Dr. Amina.
She's muted.
Could we unmute Dr. Amina, please?
I did.
Now we can.
Okay, great.
I had to mute myself so I could hear all of this conversation. Believe it or not, I thought Trump was going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And mostly because of what he was saying and how it resonated with many Americans. And I listened to my Cuban buddies, I listened to Latino buddies, and the African American community who didn't quite understand why there was a kind of push to make all Muslims the same, and you all ought to be upset about Gaza. Whether you can eat or pay the rent or anything else, you ought to be there. From students, there was a lot of pushback, as on many campuses, not all, of course, but on a few campuses, I think Columbia and Howard especially, Black students stood up for Palestinians, and they got moved aside because they were told it was not their issue and that Palestinians needed to be in charge. And believe me, that resonated, it got repeated, it went on. I looked at some of the things that Trump is talking about. I did read Project 2025. Oh my God, if I never read another thing that thick. Um, and he has in there, he's going to get rid of taxes. Taxes on workers, taxes for small businesses, taxes on Social Security. And everybody said, really? You know, on the other hand, I'm going to seal the borders and I'm going to reinstate my Muslim ban, literally a Muslim ban, so that all of you don't get picked up with the 11 or 12 million I'm deporting. I'll make sure that no more of you get in, kind of thing. And I don't think that became, it didn't even hit people's heads as to what's going on there. You know, when I asked the question, are we turning into Argentina? People were calling Ms. Harris a communist. I said, you don't even know what a communist is. What are you talking about? The issue is, are we going to become even more of an autocracy? You know, Israel is fighting a proxy war for us. We can't fight that war. So we set up Israel to do it. And we're funding her and sending more arms, more supplies, more whatever, so that she fights that war. And like I said last night, I think we ought to spend this time in a way being happy that we have more time to get our act together.
More time to get our act together. Definitely. A lot of the organizations that I know were on the front lines working really hard during the last Trump administration seem to be quiet and just not around for the past 4 years, even when many marginalized communities were reaching out to them. And it just seemed like there was this quietness. So, Katie, I wanted to ask you, many times, you know, as we're talking amongst ourselves and we're trying to understand the votes, where are they coming from? And I hate to pinpoint this to you, but others can join in and answer as well. How do we explain women voting for Trump?
I think that what this election was about for most people was, you know, bread and butter issues. And something that I remember Nina Turner saying this about Hillary Clinton in 2016 when she lost to Donald Trump. And of course, the Democrats pushed Bernie Sanders out, who was, I always said, was much more electable, especially in a race against Trump. Hillary Clinton had statistically, you know, incredibly high unfavorability ratings, but the Democrats were more afraid of Bernie Sanders than of Donald Trump. And what Nina Turner said, and I really think this is true, is that Trump is full of it. I hope I can say that. I'm not saying what it is, but he's a con man, but he's convincing as someone who feels people's pain and anger. Bernie Sanders, I would say, really does feel people's pain and anger. And with Hillary Clinton, no one believed that she felt anyone's pain and anger. I think the same thing could be said of Kamala Harris. I don't think anyone felt like she was connected to their pain and anger. And again, I don't think Trump cares about working people in this country, but I think he's more persuasive in that. And I think that's what this was about. I mean, the Democrats chose to court Liz Cheney and to court Cheney supporters. They increased the turnout with people who are college educated and also who make over $100,000. And that's what they got. They didn't get the people who feel like they're hurting. And I also think that, excuse me, we saw people, you know, Trump has a lot of advantages in his who he is. he's able to be totally inconsistent, and none of his supporters really care about that because he doesn't claim to have any consistency. And what that lets him do is that lets him point to other people's inconsistencies and hypocrisies, and he doesn't have to meet that same standard. So the other person, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris, they look like hypocrites, or they look like bad people or idiots. Like, he was able to say, even though this is someone who imposed a Muslim ban, he was able to say, why is Kamala Harris running around with Liz Cheney, whose father killed a lot of Muslim people and a lot of Arab people? And that's because Trump is able to do that, and the Kamala Harris people handed him that on a platter by courting Liz Cheney. And I don't know what they thought. And again, the difference between her and Biden, the one difference she could come up with was that she would have Republicans in her cabinet. Who's excited by that? I mean, that's not what the base wanted. They take their base for granted. They think that they're entitled to their votes. And we're seeing that they're not. I mean, they're not going to do. I don't think the Democratic Party is reformable, like Ron was saying, because they're not going to learn any of the lessons that they need to learn from this. And I'm someone who actually does think. I think that this is in some of the circles in which I exist, this is a controversial position. I actually think in the short run, the world will suffer more under Trump. I want to be very clear. There is a genocide in Gaza. I don't think it could get much worse in Gaza. I think it maybe could get worse in other areas of Palestine. And I think that under Trump, other things will get worse. But I'm also not going to pretend that things are okay now, or that they were okay under Biden. And Rania pointed out how terrible Biden was. And it's worth remembering that, Ronald Reagan in 1982 picked up the phone. We're talking about a Republican. Ronald Reagan picked up the phone, called Menachem Begin, and said, you need to stop bombing Lebanon. And he actually used the word Holocaust. He said, this is a Holocaust. And how is it that you have someone who is a Democrat, claims to be smart about foreign policy? How is it that you have someone in Joe Biden who is willing to do less than Ronald Reagan?
I mean, I could answer that.
Joe Biden's legacy, won't it? He will be forever known as Genocide Joe. It's as we're wrapping up this hour, I'm looking at, I feel like grocery bills were on top of people's lists on why they voted the way they did. How much their paychecks are being stretched, were they better off 4 years ago versus now? And that's really what it boiled down to. So we have about 2 minutes to our next break. So if anybody would like to have any,
I just wanted to say, Hannah, as Katie mentioned a little bit earlier, kind of the something about like basic necessities. I mean, it goes down to, right, it's gas, groceries, and mortgage payments like that, and housing crisis aside, right, and mortgage payments, and those, for the overwhelming majority of the Biden administration, were just grueling for most people. Even though it's eased a bit, right now, nobody is feeling like this great easing moment because they've spent all their money already and have racked up their credit card bills. So the fact that, we can pull apart the Harris campaign, because obviously when you lose, that's what you're kind of open to. But the unwillingness to break from Biden in so many different ways, whether it's in foreign policy, but whether it's on domestic policy as well, was just such a curious choice. And it was a choice. Like, it's not like it wasn't happenstance. It was a deliberate choice to like she was asked flat out, as we all saw, like, where are you making your break with, what's new? You're talking about new, what's new? And she didn't have an answer. And that, that left many people, deeply concerned.
Deeply concerned, definitely. So it's time to take a break. We'll be here. We're going to be here for another hour, and we're broadcasting in the United States, in Canada, Mexico, and we're also broadcasting in the United Kingdom in collaboration with Islam Channel there. So thank you, Dr. Scott, for being here and for your insights, and we'll be right back.
The 2024 U.S. presidential election is here, and Muslim Network TV is bringing you the coverage that matters. On November 5th and 6th, join us live at 8 p.m. Eastern as we dive into the election night action, bringing you real-time results and in-depth conversations on what this election means for Muslim Americans and beyond. Our panel of experts, community voices, and political analysts will break down the night's key moments, from the policies shaping America to the voices shaping our future. Stay with us as we track the vote count, analyze the big wins and losses, and discuss the issues that matter most to you, whether it's your first time voting or your 10th. This election is crucial, and we're here to keep you informed every step of the way. Join us for live election coverage you can trust, November 5th and 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern on Muslim Network TV. Election 2024. Your voice, your future. Tune in live on Muslim Network TV.
Move it to 9 p.m. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us here. We've been discussing the Trump presidency, reactions on the first day, the fact that Senate has turned red. And as we're tearing apart the Harris's campaign, we're not endorsing Trump or even suggesting at all that he would have been better than Harris. But as many of our guests pointed out, there was a red line. I know in the Muslim community, this point has been brought up that our vote, where it counted, and helped swing this election. And while the Democrats are busy with their own blame game, they'll likely point fingers at minority communities, Muslims, Hispanics, even though our contributions, while impactful, were smaller than the economy and other issues that drove most voters. The real story in this election is even broader. Harris actually gained ground amongst white men and women, both college educated and not, across economic levels. But she lost ground with minorities, and the Hispanic vote in particular tipped the scales. So this is something very interesting. And add that to the growing frustration over issues like the economy and perceived overreach in school curriculum, and you have the perfect storm of voter discontent. So to discuss this and much more, we have with us our next gen host on Muslim Network TV, a young scholar. She's in law school, Amina Ahmed. Thank you so much, Amina, for joining us.
Thank you, Hannah, for having me here. I'm not in law school yet. I will be going to law school very soon, but thank you for having me.
So looking forward to hearing a youth perspective to this election. How are you feeling? Yeah. What are you hearing? What are you seeing on your social media feed?
Right, and there is definitely two perspectives to this. One of them, let's talk about social media first, because you brought that up. One of the perspectives that we are seeing on social media is a lot of people, a lot of young people, a lot of activists are surprised by the results. And I think the reason for that is so many of us live in these echo chambers where we think that this is the reality of every single person around me, when that might not exactly be the case. And they're like, how did this happen, right? How did we get to this point? I thought Kamala was going to win. You know, some people, I mean, obviously, if you're living in that echo chamber, they thought that the impact of Jill and the third party would be greater than it was, you know, in the results. So we see this shock and surprise of young people, of activists, of people who have been organizing, but again, in their circles. And then outside of social media, you know, I was at university until like a couple of hours ago. There is definitely, depending obviously on the university that you go to, but keeping in mind that most universities, especially public universities, lean towards the Democrats, lean towards being more liberal. We see that there is a bit of defeat that they are feeling. But then there are those who have been organizing for Palestine, those who do not feel joy, but who do not feel relief either. So I mean, there is so many different perspectives, but as a young person, obviously I don't represent all young people, but there is that feeling of, I am not happy that Trump won, but again, I don't feel, relief either that, about the loss. So it really is a weird feeling. And I think you have discussed this before on the show. It is not just Palestine, it is looking at the economy. I mean, most Americans are voting based on who they think is going to lower their gas prices, who is going to lower their grocery prices. So obviously that is one of the reasons. But for those who have been organizing for Palestine, there's that in the middle feeling there, Hannah, honestly.
Thank you for that perspective. And we are joined right now by Brother Edward Ahmed Mitchell. Could we bring him on screen? He is our analyst on Muslim Network TV, and he's also the National Deputy Executive Director of Council on American Islamic Relations. So thank you so much for joining us again, Brother Edward. We were here with you yesterday, and we were looking at the results, and today those results have, we were predicting this would happen. What are your thoughts today as you spent the day? And I'm sure you took a day to just absorb what had happened, but I know you have been planning for either scenario. So what are you thinking?
Right. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wasalam, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good to see you. So, I mean, we obviously knew it was going to be either Trump or Harris. And as an organization, we had, spent some time planning out how to respond to either scenario. But rather than speak to that, I'll just say, as a person, I was still surprised by how badly the vice president lost by. I thought maybe she'll lose Pennsylvania and that'll be it, but she lost Pennsylvania, she lost Wisconsin, she lost Michigan. Looks like she's going to lose Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia. It was a clean sweep, and Donald Trump managed to do well across the entire country. So I was surprised by how poorly she did. The second thing that got to me was that Gaza was a factor. If you look at Michigan and the result there, the fact that her total raw vote count was so low compared to what Biden got in 2020. Some votes went to Jill Stein, some went to Trump, but a lot of people just didn't show up. There are millions of people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 who did not show up at all in this election. That could also be people who are upset about Gaza. So I do think it played some role, but to be frank, it wasn't the definitive role. I suspect that even if every American Muslim had voted for Kamala Harris, she still would have lost because Trump's victory was so widespread. And so I'm surprised. We were kind of preparing for either scenario, but I'm surprised by how bad the defeat was. And last thing I'll say is that Donald Trump did not improve his standing from 2020. If you actually look at his raw vote total, he, as of this point, got about 3 million fewer votes than he got in 2020. But the Democrats plummeted, right? Joe Biden got 81 million votes, and Kamala Harris has dived all the way down to about 70 million. So it's not like there were a sudden rise of people in America supporting Donald Trump. It's that he held his own, and then the Democrats lost a lot that they had 4 years ago.
We're joined by Josh Paul, former State Department and one of the founders of New Policy. Josh Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So there are several questions that I have looking at the what's next. And I know, Josh, you have been planning and thinking way beyond this election, especially for a new policy on Palestine, on the Middle East. So can you tell us a little bit more about the work you have been doing, and and tell us more about new policy?
Sure. Thank you very much, Hannah. Good to see you. So the premise we're working from, which I think we can all agree, having watched the last election cycle play out, is that what we have ultimately looks like a policy problem, but is ultimately a political problem. there are entrenched interests in American politics that prevent even politicians who may behind closed doors recognize the problems of our policy and the horrific effects that they are having on the Palestinians in Gaza in particular, but also on America's own interests, but who will not say so publicly because they are afraid, frankly, of the role of money in politics. I think it was interesting just drawing the string out on what Edward just saying a bit further, that I think one of the takeaways here is if you look at the advertising that AIPAC has been putting out in the wake of this election, they've been saying repeatedly that, look at all these candidates we supported. Unconditional support for Israel is a political winner. And I think that if you ask Kamala Harris if she agrees with that, I suspect she would not. But in any event, I think what we've seen and what we've known even before yesterday's vote is that the problem we face here transcends any one election. It is not something that a Harris win was going to fix or a Trump win was going to fix. It is something that is going to take several cycles to work through, probably many election cycles. And it's also something that reminds us that politics isn't about a single election, or politics or democracy isn't about a single ballot. It's about an ongoing engagement within the system at all levels. And so that's what a new policy is here to bring.
So,
Josh, this is Edward Mitchell. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Question for you. Now that President Trump is returning to office, how do you think activists should engage with his administration? Should it be just, getting ready for battle right away and assuming that he's not going to move at all in terms of stopping the genocide, the war on Gaza? Or do you think there is an opportunity to see if he's really serious when he says that he wants to end the bloodshed and bring this to an end? How do you think activists should engage with his administration, if at all?
So I think President Trump, if he is anything like the President Trump we know from his last administration, will be transactional when it comes to the Middle East. And I think we should be prepared for a transactional relationship with President Trump. I think there are clearly some issues that we should be very concerned about. Top of that list is probably civil rights here at home and the ability of students on campuses like Amina, who's with us here, to speak out and to continue to have those rights and freedoms. And I think that probably is a battle we need to be prepared for. On the other hand, I think that President Trump will seek to find ways to wind down and to end the genocide that has been happening in Gaza, at least in the form it is now taking. That doesn't mean that he's going to put us on a good long-term trajectory here. I think what his advisors and many of the voices he will be hearing from share is a desire to get Palestine off the front pages. But that said, I think there will certainly be opportunities here, perhaps on a narrow basis, and perhaps with some rather thin pickings, but some opportunities here to find ways that we can work together on specific tracks. And look, when you have President Trump in the White House, a Republican Senate, and a U.S. House of Representatives that is on the very least on a knife's edge, you have to find those opportunities. You can't just play a defensive game, but you have to be willing to reach out and find places to work together.
So, Josh, when you left the State Department, you recently left, and in protest of U.S. foreign policy, for those in the audience who may not know, and now that Trump is back, what changes do you expect in the State Department? First, were you there under the first Trump administration? What changes happened then, and what concrete changes do you think are going to happen now?
Yes, I did serve through the entirety of the last Trump administration. I was also there for the Obama administration. I think, first of all, look, there are going to be some changes at the top, right? With no question. We know that Secretary Blinken is going to go. We know that National Security Advisor Sullivan is going to go. I think what we don't know is whether National Security Coordinator for the Middle East, Brett McGurk, is going to go. And I think that is something that a lot of people will be paying a lot of attention to because he has played a significant role in the current situation. So I think there'll be some changes there. What we saw during the previous Trump administration was also significant efforts to cut the State Department's budget and to disempower significant aspects of the State Department role while focusing on security assistance and arms transfers. I do think that there will be a similar approach under this administration. I think we have to see how that plays out. I think when we look at the situation in Israel-Palestine, we can recognize that the United States is not an honest broker at this time. And so one can question whether actually continuing to push the same approach to the State Department is in our interest or in the interest of the Palestinian people or anyone in the region. But I think we'll have to keep a very close eye on what form that takes. And of course, we know that President Trump also is going to take a look at the question of appointments within the State Department and civil service reform. And that's something I think we also need to keep an eye on, because even throughout this horrific last year, there have been a lot of really good people in the government working to try and push things in the right direction. And I think many of those people will now be concerned as to whether they will be able to hold on to what have up to this point been protected jobs.
Josh, can I ask you about Brett McGurk in particular? Because this is a name that I think a lot of Americans don't know, but those of us who are following the issue closely do know his name. And he's someone who has survived multiple administrations. There was a political article about him a few years ago. And the joke was that if a nuclear bomb hit DC, cockroaches and Brett McGurk would survive. He was there for Trump, for Bush. He's always there playing this role in the Middle East. And some say a damaging role. What can you tell us about him and his influence in the administration?
So as you've just alluded to, Brett is the ultimate bureaucratic survivor. His ability to hold on through and across administrations does speak, frankly, to his capabilities. He is not, foolish, or in that sense, he's very capable at navigating politics. And I think that's one of the things that has made him valuable to multiple presidents in a row when it comes to navigating the politics of the Middle East. That said, he has made a lot of wrong calls, I think, over the course of his career. One of them being the, sense that you could somehow forget about the Palestinian issue and push forward with a regional normalization without resolving Palestinian human rights, without resolving Palestinian statehood. And that has been a great cause of why we are where we are right now. So I hope that it is recognized that, as good as his relationships may be with regimes in some countries, he is not a man who necessarily has a deep understanding of the region. He's not spent a lot of time there. He does not speak Arabic. And, I think that, that there are some very good reasons, very good arguments, I think, to President Trump, why it might be time for a change in that portfolio.
Great. And we are joined right now with another guest. I'd like to bring him on, Dr. Chris Ferguson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here, and very clearly coming from a different perspective as a Canadian living and working in Colombia, and mostly reflecting profoundly about geopolitics and global ethics. So very helpful to hear the perspective from within the struggle for justice within the United States.
Yes, I'm very interested in what you have been hearing and seeing, the reaction to Trump's presidency in Latin America. What are you seeing? You're based in Colombia, and what are the implications of this election on where you are?
Yeah, I mean, to take, I think, Dr. Paul's point, I mean, I think it's understood that what all of this is about is that there's not either a political or a policy problem, but what everybody is confronting is an empire problem, that this has to be seen through the lens of a global system dominated by neoliberal capitalism and defended by military empire and all its ideological bits. And so that I think that that clearly, I mean, it depends where you stand, and as you say, whether people are positioning themselves around the issue. But going into the election, most, I think, progressive people dealing with the context and seeing the rise of authoritarianism in Latin America. Someone referenced, I think, in with your previous panel, referenced Argentina. Of course, we can add to that all the other focus, and particularly dramatically in El Salvador and recently in Ecuador and so on, the strong focus of the rise of models of authoritarian leadership, punitive justice, and I think that this understanding that what we're dealing with is an economic system that's imposed, that has created a situation of the inequality that is worldwide, that is a machine for destruction, not only genocide, but also destruction of the planet. Colombia here just celebrated the biodiversity COP, or Committee of Parties. And it's very clear that that global geopolitics are about the positioning of power blocks around a new economic reality, and it's not serving the American people, but it's not serving any people anywhere. So I think that the understanding is less focused on why Kamala lost, but a clear understanding of why Trump won. That this whole idea of the reaccommodation of power around projects of white supremacy and economic domination. I mean, at the same time that the last weeks of the election were playing out, were the BRICS summit, the realignment, where you don't see clear political agreement among the BRICS nations, but you do see an understanding of clearly taking on American military, political, and economic hegemony. So who is going to steer the ship, but not challenging fundamentally this unjust economic system, which in fact BRICS is deepening and defending and protecting. So that the emergence of Trump as the option of people in the United States who the penny drops that the Democrats are not for them. I mean, there is no real talk. The Walz-Harris campaign, after you got Biden out of the way, focused profoundly on their idea about the middle class and creating an idea that a diverse and corporately indebted Democratic Party could make things better for some people in the United States. But clearly that would be at the expense of everybody else in the United States, and that it would still be drawn out under the basic rules of this is a world system that works for few and abandons the many. And I think it's no surprise that people in their desperation thought that the person to go with would be the person that had more no than yes to the current system in all its ambiguities, including the myth that
Amina, I'd like you to jump in over here because what Dr. Ferguson was saying is reminding me of this bond that many of these fascists have with each other, especially as we look at India and the Modi regime there. And with Trump coming into power, and I know you have been working on this for a while, just wanted to hear your thoughts and some reflections on what Dr. Ferguson has been talking about. Sure.
I mean, first of all, just the parallels that you see between the Modi regime, between kind of, I see a lot of people comparing fascism and some of Trump's tactics to Modi, to even Netanyahu in some instances. But the reality is what we're seeing in India obviously is very different. It is at a different level. And what we are seeing in Israel against the Palestinians, what is being perpetrated to people in Gaza is very, very different than the system in place in America. So talking a little bit about the Modi regime, we see India as the largest democracy, obviously. And we see it as, the second most populous country. And we see it just being a democracy on paper, right? And a lot of people, obviously, many of our viewers even may not know about the extent of how limited democracy is in India. We see minorities, the Dalits, the Muslims, the Christians being unfairly targeted by laws that the Modi regime has pushed. We see, the CAA, we saw that back in 2020 before the pandemic, and that is continuing today. So obviously what we have in India is different than what we have in America, but it is very easy for countries to follow in the path of where we have India today, where it is almost on the brink of democracy. I mean, a lot of scholars, a lot of experts wouldn't even call it a democracy anymore. So we have young people in America looking at the regimes across the world, looking at the rise of fascism across the world, and feeling a fear that is America headed in that direction. Obviously, I personally think that there is fear mongering involved, but I think there's also a reality to it. And I will put it on our other guests to answer, what is the direction that America is headed in? And how much does that change under a Trump presidency? And I was talking with a congresswoman in our district, and she talked about, and I live in the Chicagoland area, I won't throw her under the bus, but she was talking about how organizing under a Trump presidency is going to be extremely difficult. And she was talking to Muslim voters who were thinking to vote third party. And she said, and I'm summarizing, but your vote is going to be wasted. Don't vote third party. Make sure that you're voting for Kamala. Vote Democrat, because if you vote third party, that is a vote for Trump. And it will be extremely difficult for you to organize under a Republican Party and for you to organize under a Trump presidency. So one question that I had for her was, it has already been difficult for students to organize in the past 4 years when Kamala Harris was vice president. It was extremely difficult for us to set up encampments. I mean, my university, I go to the University of Illinois, Chicago, has banned encampments completely. The way that our freedom of expression, our freedom of speech is limited, it is unheard of. For a lot of us, we grew up hearing that freedom of speech is our constitutional right. But the reality is, in universities, public and private, if you look at DePaul, University of Chicago, Northwestern, it is the same across the board. Students' voices and their freedom of expression and speech are suppressed. So in the past 4 years, going back to my point, in the Biden-Kamala Harris presidency, we also had a suppression of our constitutional rights, right? As students, that's how we feel. And I anticipate the same thing in the next 4 years. But I mean, I push this off to you, Josh. How do you see that changing in a Trump presidency? How do you see organizing? I mean, you have been doing this work for years. How will it be more difficult, different, easier for students to organize under a Trump presidency? How will that change from the past 4 years?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think that's maybe the fundamental question, because if we can't organize, if we don't have the space for the policy debates, both in government and in schools and universities and on the streets of America, then our chances of seeing any of the changes that we would like to see are massively diminished. So first of all, I think this is exactly the question to be asking. If we look at the track record of other quote unquote backsliding democracies, and India is a bit of an unusual example in this case, in that it was almost essentially a two-party system between the BJP and the Congress Party. Most of these countries where we see democratic backsliding, Poland, Hungary, and others, you tend to have a populist party that takes a majority, but then faces a coalition of smaller groups and thrives through fracturing that coalition. And that's how these groups hold these sort of populist parties. Italy is another example of a backsliding democracy, hold onto power by essentially fracturing their opposition, whether through arresting leaders in some cases, or setting them off against each other, or various other approaches. I think that's the key to the answer here. The key to standing up in the context of an American backsliding democracy is coalition building, and it is coalition not only building but maintaining, and that's sometimes harder than the building. And we saw that, in the context of the last election, where there were a lot of debates within American communities of, yes, we recognize, for example, the pain that the Arab American and Muslim American communities, and particularly the Palestinian American community, are feeling in the context of Gaza. But think about what your vote will mean for the African American community or for other minority communities in America. And I think finding ways to rebuild those bridges, strengthen those bridges, and find the commonality of purpose. I think the more people we can bring into this movement, whether it be on Palestine or this broader movement on civil rights, and hear voices, for example, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, are vital in painting a picture for people of that commonality, of course. But I think coalition building is probably the most important piece of this going forward.
So we're going to take a short break. Please stay with us. Our guests will be back with us after this short break.
Assalamu alaikum. Exciting things are happening at Muslim News. We're dedicated to uncovering the stories that matter to you with international coverage and deep analysis from a fresh viewpoint. Find us where you get your news. Your world, your stories, your Muslim Network TV. Stay informed, stay connected. Watch now. The 2024 U.S. presidential election is here, and Muslim Network TV is bringing you the coverage that matters, bringing you real-time results and in-depth conversations on what this election means for Muslim Americans and beyond. Our panel of experts, community voices, and political analysts will break down the night's key moments. This election is crucial, and we're here to keep you informed. November 5th and 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern on Muslim Network TV.
Welcome back. Thank you so much to our panelists for staying with us this late at night. Edward, I have a question for you. Our community building, regarding our community building, political power isn't just about casting a vote every 4 years. It's about sustained influence. So what steps do you recommend for Muslims and allied communities to increase local political influence and advocate for structural changes?
That's a good question. So, I'm going to say something that might sound odd, but I think we actually have to learn from our opponents. If you look at groups like AIPAC, the NRA, pick your lobby group, they're very effective because they don't just wait for a presidential election to come around and then suddenly get engaged. They are, from the beginning of a person's political career, engaging with them. They identify people who are promising, and they go to support them early, provide them with training and connections, and they are with them throughout their career so that when they reach some high office that is relevant to foreign policy, they've been indoctrinated already. They're ready to go. I've seen this myself at the college that I attended, Morehouse College, which is, y'all may know, is historically black college. Martin Luther King went there. We would have young, promising black men who looked like they might go into politics one day, who would be approached by AIPAC and would end up joining the AIPAC youth training program. And I won't name names, but one of them is now became elected to a state position, is now a relatively prominent media commentator. And so I think organizationally, we should be, reaching out to people and make connections with them, early in their careers. And beyond that, everyday Americans, including American Muslims, should be engaging in their political system throughout the year, right? Talking to your city council members, your school board members, your state representatives, yes, your members of Congress, not just when it's election time, but engaging with them regularly and building relationships and educating them about the concerns that you have, whether it's domestic or foreign. Inviting them to the mosque, for example, for your Ramadan interfaith dinners, for other events, town halls and things. There has to be regular engagement, and it has to happen early so that eventually, 5 years, 10 years down the line, they are familiar with the issues that you care about, and they are understanding of those issues. And the last thing I would say is that, sadly, money is still plays a definitive role in our politics, right? Politicians want to get elected, and it requires money often to do that. And so obviously our community does donate, but not nearly as much as other communities. And so if we really want to have a major impact, we're going to not have to not only vote, not have to only engage, but also we're going to have to figure out a way to make sure we are donating money to candidates who share our values.
Right.
Hannah, I think you've got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, you were muted. Sure.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, Josh, I wanted to ask this question of you. Our country supplies weapons across the globe and fuels wars and conflicts across it, not just Gaza, it's everywhere. And this military industrial complex, it has money, it has power, it has lobby. A lot of times we just look at these conflicts and we believe it may be just APAC, it may be just in special interest groups like that, but in reality it is these major corporations who want to sell more weapons. So what can activists on the streets, what can people who are sick and tired of their tax dollars paying for killing people abroad instead of being used, everybody, as we can see, the top concern was the economy. And it's our money is not being used in our own country. So having worked in this field, what are your thoughts about actually bringing some change to this paradigm?
Thanks, Hannah. I think that's a really important question. Before I answer it, I just want to go back to one thing that Edward just said, just very quickly, which is on the question of funding and resources. I think the fact actually is that if you look at the number of political action committees that have sprung up in the last year to support Palestine and the spending through those, through independent expenditures, through lobbying, and through charitable contributions, particularly from the Muslim American community, there is a fair amount of money that is available. I think part of the problem is that it's not being channeled in a way that is strategic and therefore not being particularly effective. And I think one of the things we can do better as a movement and as communities is make sure that we are talking to each other, coordinating our spending and channeling those resources more efficiently and more effectively, because I think there is a lot more, if you'll excuse the phrase, bang for the buck if we do so. Speaking of bang for the buck, so yes, I mean, war is big business. I think there are a number of things that we can do if we want to see change in that respect. I think one of the most important of them, frankly, is pushing for transparency. A lot of the arms deals we're talking about, a lot of the weapons trade happens behind closed doors, and it's actually protected from public transparency by laws. Let's see if we can mount an effort to change some of those laws, because it's very hard to chip away at something that you can't even see, let alone fully understand. So I think transparency is the first part there. The other thing I would say is that yes, the US does spend a fair amount of taxpayer money on security assistance overseas. Taking away the last couple of years, which have been a bit of an aberration with Ukraine and Israel, it's still, you're talking in the range of $20 billion a year that we send overseas. Let's remember, however, that that's $20 billion out of about $180 billion in total defense trade. There is a demand signal coming from overseas. And one of the other important things I think we can do is partner with civil societies in the countries and in the places that are feeling the impacts of that defense trade, to help them raise their voices in their own context as well, because we can't just address this on the supply side, we need to address it on the demand side as well.
Absolutely. Yes, it's an intricate system, and definitely, and then the people are scared that if they don't buy American bombs, they're going to buy Russian bombs or Korean bombs. So yes, this is the anti-war movement in this country, unfortunately, sort of fell by the wayside after Iraq, and hopefully with this renewed interest in the peace movement because of Gaza, that energy can be harnessed and we can work towards local policies, divestment from arms sales in our local communities, and as well as Josh was saying, working towards policies that in Congress that would give us more transparency on this. So as we're about to wrap up this session, I'd like to give each one of you a chance to give your final thoughts for the night, and as we prep for this next coming year, 4 years of Trump presidency?
So I'll say a few things. One, I think the American Muslim community back in 2016, when Trump unexpectedly won, was quite nervous. Not only because of the rhetoric, that he had shared, because we didn't know what to expect. We have been through 4 years of Trump. A lot of people suffered, under some really, but God bless your uncle. But we made it. Thank God. And so I think for us, there's less of a fear this time, but more of kind of feeling of, all right, here we go again. Let's get back to work. And I think the other unique thing about the situation we face now is that, Donald Trump has, to his credit, made some effort late in the campaign to reach out to Muslim voters. In fact, it was very strange to see him arguing, criticizing Kamala Harris for embracing Liz Cheney, and to see Donald Trump saying Liz Cheney would bomb the Middle East and bomb Muslim countries if she could, and that Muslim Arab Americans shouldn't support her, and that he wants Muslim Arab American support, is very unique. And so I do think there is this unique question of whether or not that was just campaign rhetoric, or whether or not Donald Trump really means it when he says he has an anti-war streak. I think he does have an anti-war streak compared to a Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis. But it's also true he nearly sparked a war with Iran when he killed Qasem Soleimani during his presidency. So he's also surrounded by people who are extremely anti-Palestinian, extremely anti-Muslim, who want a war with Iran. So I think a big question mark is, how much is he going to run things? How much of his late campaign rhetoric did he really mean? Is there some opportunity to engage with him? Or is it just going to be, again, getting ready for battle and going into battle with his administration for the next 4 years? So I'll be very curious to see how the transition plays out, who he's appointing, who he's picking, because I think that will tell us a lot about what he plans to do in terms of the Muslim community.
Right. And we see, just going off your point, we do see an increase to Muslim voters, obviously, in the Trump presidency, especially the last few days of the campaign. So my message would be to students, to university students, to organizers, to activists who have been doing the work for the past year. One thing that Josh was saying is we have seen in the past year, since October 7th, an increase in C4s, in C3s, in money being pooled to help those in Gaza, to help students who are here in America that come from a Palestinian background. So there has been a lot of work that is done in the past year. So I think as a Muslim community, we should give ourselves some credit. I mean, we have been working hard. There has been political discourse centered around the Muslim community. So that is one thing. I think we should give ourselves a little bit of credit. I think we've been doing a good job for the past year. And the second thing is to ensure that we're continuing that during a Trump presidency. Obviously, we're all curious to see how this is going to play out, how the interaction between President Trump and, for the next 4 years and the Muslim community will look like. But as young people, we have to continue to organize. We have to continue to protest. We have to continue to advocate for the change that we need to see.
Yeah, for my part, I'll just say very quickly three quick things. The first is that I think we need to make sure that the takeaway of the American political ecosystem from the last election is that Gaza mattered. And it didn't just matter in terms of votes, in particular in Michigan, but throughout the election cycle, it was a leading indicator that if the Democratic Party had been paying attention to, they would be in a very different place today. It was a leading indicator of President Biden's weakness before that fateful first debate. It was a leading indicator of Kamala Harris's rise. And then when she refused to separate herself from President Biden, a leading indicator of her decline. And so I think that there is a lot that we can be talking about in this space. And I think we need to keep reminding the political ecosystem of what Gaza meant, not just directly, but what it means and should mean in their analysis of the youth vote, of voter participation, and of where the party should be looking, both in terms of American interests and American moral leadership. Second thing, to sort of piggyback off what Amina was just saying, is that, yes, so coalition building is key. And not only that, but organizing is key. And that there is more to democracy than elections. It is great that we are sitting here the day after an election and talking politics. We need to be talking politics every single day. We need to be thinking now about the cycle that is beginning today, that is going to lead to the next elections in 2026 for Congress and in 2028, the general elections then, and asking what we can be doing now to position ourselves within those cycles and for those cycles for the long term. And on that note, if you'll permit me, I'll my third thing is I'll just end with a quick plug. Please do come and visit us at www.anewpolicy.org and find out more about how we are trying to join the ecosystem of so many groups that are pushing on these issues to make the change we need to see.
Thank you. Dr. Ferguson, did you want to have, as
No, thank you
wrap
for
up
the great. I think the point that that I do here is that all this points to the kind of alliance building and focus that needs to happen is for the Muslim community in the United States, along with all religious communities, to focus on the issues of an unjust worldwide economic and political system. That what Gaza revealed, among other things, is that the genocide is part of a larger system of oppression and on freedom, and that the alliances that need to be built with all those people that are suffering under that yoke. And so I would say the invitation to organize is to build alliances with the poor and the economically oppressed in the United States. And also, I think we didn't talk about it, but I think the deepening and strengthening of the ideology of white supremacy and Christian nationalism is a chance for new kinds of coalitions between the Muslim community and Christian communities that are against Christian nationalism, and there are those. So I hope that the kind of organizing takes on both the rise of authoritarian ideologies as well as linking arms with other people who are struggling economically to see the roots of the pain and distress within a larger worldwide economic system that needs to be transformed and which aids and abets genocide.
Well, I want to thank all our guests so profoundly for spending today with us, for giving your insights. Especially, I didn't get to say goodbye to Sabrina Sabi, the podcaster who came on early on, and she had some amazing insights, and I did want to thank her. And to all of you, Josh and Dr. Ferguson, Brother Edward, Amina, as we end this, our segment, our election coverage, tonight's discussion has made one thing absolutely clear. This election wasn't just about who won. It's about power, it's about influence, and it's about resilience. Gaza is still going through genocide. People are still starving. We still have Uyghurs in concentration camps in China. There are so many Muslim minorities around the world are suffering. People in the global south are suffering because of our environmental policies. Right here in our neighbors are suffering. People can't put food on their table. They can't pay rent. Our kids can't afford college. And these are absolutely important issues. And this is absolutely not the time to disengage from the political process and to declare that we're done. I'm going to go into my own cave and not be a part of this process. It is up to us to take lessons from this moment and build something real. To everyone watching, I urge you to stay informed, to stay engaged, and most of all, to stay united. We cannot let these forces divide us. We need to care about our neighbors, whether they're unhoused, whether they are undocumented, whether they are those who are suffering because they might be deported. These are very, very valid concerns of our brothers and sisters. We were just discussing this earlier. Our Black community is struggling. This is what we saw 4 years ago. Let's not forget this is the same presidency that's back. So as we center Gaza, because that is absolutely something that I do not want anybody to forget. Gaza was the Muslim community's red line. We proved that, we showed that, we believed it, and our voices have more power than many realize. So I thank you for joining us on Muslim Network TV on our special election coverage. And together, let's keep pushing forward. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto all of you.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Walaikum salam. Thank you, Anna.